Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore a journey that might make you look at your daily routine with entirely different eyes. Before we dive in, take a second to like and subscribe if this kind of content speaks to you, and drop a comment with your time zone and what time you're watching. It's always fun to see how far and wide this community reaches. Now, turn down the lights, maybe switch on a fan or light a candle, and let your thoughts drift back. Way back. Because while you might think your alarm clock, your calendar, and even your weekend routine are modern inventions, the truth is, much of what shapes our lives today was set in motion by people who believed demons lived in sneezes and forks were tools of the devil. Take, for example, your 9-to-5 schedule. It feels industrial, right? Like it was born in a Victorian factory surrounded by gears, soot, and strict men in top hats. But actually, the blueprint for your workday comes from a much quieter and stranger place: medieval monasteries. Back when most people were still telling time by the sun or just guessing, monks were the ones who decided it mattered to track the hours with relentless precision, not for productivity, but for piety. Their lives revolved around a relentless rhythm of bells: time to rise, time to chant, time to eat, time to pray, time to regret your life choices and pretend you liked silence. They divided the day into strange-sounding segments like matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. These weren't designed to make the day efficient. They were meant to dissolve your sense of individuality. You weren't meant to plan your time. You were meant to surrender it, and it didn't stop at the abbey walls. Over time, that relentless structure of bells started leaking into the world outside. Towns began using them to open markets. Guilds used them to coordinate shifts. And when factories eventually arrived, centuries later, they adopted the system wholesale, minus the prayers, plus more shouting. What started as a spiritual timetable eventually became a secular sentence. You, me, everyone stumbling out of bed at 7 a.m. with a groan and a cup of caffeine. We're not modern citizens. We're monks in disguise, minus the robes and gilt, with slightly worse coffee. Even your lunch break? That's a hand-me-down from monastic schedules, too. The sext hour was when monks paused midday. Not for joy or creativity, but because their bodies and minds were about to short-circuit from repetition. So they prayed, or snacked, probably both. So tomorrow, when your alarm drags you into another bleary morning, remember, you're not caught in capitalism. You're echoing centuries of spiritual timekeeping, rebranded as a spreadsheet and a Slack ping. And that's just the beginning. When someone near you sneezes, your first reflex might be to say, "Bless you." It seems polite, automatic, even considerate. The kind of phrase that makes you feel briefly connected to another human being through a shared gesture of civility. But this tiny phrase, tossed into the air like a social ping-pong ball, has nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with a medieval terror of the invisible. Centuries ago, in a Europe suffocated by plague, mystery, and theological dread, sneezing wasn't a harmless burst of nasal drama. It was an omen, and not a subtle one. To sneeze in public was to announce, loudly and without warning, that you might be on death's doorstep. Not only your own soul, but potentially the souls of those around you were now in danger. People watched you with a mixture of fear, judgment, and fatalistic resignation. And behind this, anxiety lay a belief even stranger than the symptoms themselves. They believed your soul could escape through your nose. That's not metaphor, that's literal. In the medieval worldview, the body was not merely flesh, but a fragile container of spirit, a leaky envelope constantly threatened by the forces of hell. When a person sneezed, violently, unpredictably, it was thought that the soul, startled by the shock, might fly out and hover for a vulnerable moment in the air. And who might be lurking nearby to seize it? Satan, or one of his lesser minions. That's why, in the year 590 CE, Pope Gregory the Great issued a simple but urgent command. If someone sneezes, say, "God bless you," not out of courtesy, but out of spiritual necessity. That phrase was not encouragement. It was a verbal barricade against the devil himself. Every "bless you" became a micro-prayer, a flash of divine protection shouted through fear-stained breath. This wasn't isolated superstition. It spread across the continent like, well, a virus. Entire villages adopted the practice with such religious fervor that sneezing became a community event. If someone sneezed during market day, you might hear a dozen different voices cry out, "Bless you," in various dialects and decibel levels, each hoping to add a layer of holy insulation between your soul and the infernal unknown. And of course, the practice endured. Because habits built on fear are the hardest to kill. Even as science slowly replaced superstition, even as microscopes replaced relics and soap replaced prayers, the words stuck. We stopped believing the devil was after our breath, but we didn't stop saying the phrase we once used to scare him away. Now, when you hear someone say, "Bless you," what you're really hearing is an echo of plagues and prayers, of priests and peasants, of a time when life was so fragile that any bodily reaction might have been the first sign of doom. You're not participating in politeness. You're reenacting a 1,000-year-old exorcism in miniature. Ironically, the very thing people were so afraid of, a sneeze carrying death, wasn't entirely wrong. Modern science tells us a sneeze can eject over 100,000 droplets at speeds up to 100 miles per hour. In other words, you're not expelling your soul. You're launching a microscopic assault on everyone around you. The danger is real, but the response? Still medieval. We live in a world filled with disinfectants, vaccines, and HEPA filters. But one sneeze in a crowded room still makes people freeze. They look. They hesitate. And then, almost involuntarily, someone mumbles, "Bless you." Not because they believe in demons, but because, deep down, they remember something older than science. A fear passed down through generations, hidden inside a phrase that pretends to be polite but was born in raw communal terror. So next time you sneeze and someone blesses you, smile. You've just reconnected with a tradition that began in plague-ridden streets where hope and fear danced in the air like dust motes in a cathedral. A tradition that reminds us, no matter how advanced we get, some fears are too old to fully vanish. Imagine sitting at a dinner table, twirling a bit of pasta with a fork, maybe cutting your chicken with a quiet grace. It feels civilized, a sign of refinement. But had you done that in medieval Europe, even as late as the 14th century, you might have been accused of blasphemy. Or worse, vanity. Because the fork, that slender metal tool with its neat prongs, was once a lightning rod for moral outrage. It started innocently enough. Somewhere around the 11th century, wealthy nobles from the Byzantine Empire began bringing over an odd little invention to Western Europe. These tiny golden utensils, delicate, beautifully made, were used to handle food in a way that spared the hands from getting greasy. Practical, elegant, hygienic. But to the clergy of Western Europe, it was none of those things. They saw it as an insult, not to decorum, but to God. After all, God, in his infinite wisdom, had already given mankind 10 perfectly good tools for eating. Fingers. To prefer metal to flesh? That, in their minds, was bordering on heresy. Take the infamous case of a Byzantine princess who married into Venetian royalty. She brought with her not only wealth and perfume, but also her gold forks. And when she used them at the table, local priests and moralists lost their composure. Not long after, she died, likely of the plague. But clergy declared it was divine judgment for her arrogance. She had dared to eat with an instrument rather than the holy tools of her own body. That judgment stuck. For centuries, forks were treated with suspicion. Even as knives and spoons gained general acceptance, tools that could be easily justified as necessary for cutting or scooping, the fork felt wrong. There was something about those little teeth, too dainty, too refined, too foreign. The church doubled down. Using a fork wasn't just a personal choice. It was a declaration that you valued worldly beauty and sanitation more than divine simplicity, that you believed human invention could improve on God's work. A dangerous sentiment in a time when questioning the divine order could get you exiled or executed. But there was an irony brewing. While theologians preached that God-made fingers were sufficient, thousands of people continued dying from foodborne illnesses passed through, what else? Dirty hands. No matter how pious the argument, it turned out that greasy palms and communal bowls weren't a recipe for eternal salvation. They were a recipe for dysentery. Still, the fear of the fork persisted, especially in Northern Europe. Even during the Renaissance, an era exploding with innovation, many nobles refused to adopt forks. They saw them as foreign affectations, unnatural extensions of vanity. Some English gentlemen went so far as to declare them effeminate, a ridiculous label born out of anxiety that grace and cleanliness might somehow be a threat to masculinity or morality. It took centuries and a shift in cultural taste for forks to truly enter the mainstream. Italy, with its pasta and flair for elegance, led the way. Slowly, the fork transformed from a sin into a fashion statement. By the 17th century, European elites were using forks at grand banquets, and before long, the middle classes followed suit. Eventually, the English caved too, not because they changed their minds, but because no one wants to look backwards at dinner. Today, every place setting includes a fork, usually more than one, a whole array for salad, meat, dessert. We barely think twice. Yet each time you lift one to your mouth, you're partaking in a rebellion against centuries of superstition, suspicion, and sweaty fingers. You're not just eating, you're winning a silent, silver war against the medieval church's fear of elegance. The next time someone critiques your table manners, or worse, your choice to eat with a certain utensil, smile. You're part of a grand tradition of defiance. A victory for logic over dogma, cleanliness over chaos. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of heaven or history, a Byzantine princess is probably laughing, fork in hand, untouched by judgment. In today's world, a bachelor party means friends, drinks, bad decisions, and maybe a plastic crown or matching t-shirts. A few laughs, a few memories, perhaps a few regrets. But in the Middle Ages, a bachelor party was more than a pre-wedding celebration. It was a ritualized descent into chaos, a farewell not just to freedom, but to a version of masculinity that was about to be leashed by law, land, and legacy. Back then, marriage was no soft affair of love and vows. It was a contract, a financial transaction. Dowries were exchanged, alliances forged, inheritances secured. And while emotions weren't absent, they were certainly secondary. Marriage was about property, bloodlines, and obedience. But even in such rigid systems, there was room for rebellion. One last night before the ceremony. To be wild, to be stupid, to be ungovernable. This was the stag night. Named for the stag, a creature symbolizing male vitality, freedom, and danger. These gatherings were less party, more performance. A night's final hours before matrimony were often spent in a smoky tavern or a candlelit manor, surrounded by companions eager to toast his bravery for entering the jaws of legal union. And by bravery, of course, they meant foolishness. The guests would drink a lot, ale, mead, and strong wine poured endlessly, not out of celebration, but as a sort of collective anesthesia. Because everyone there, groom included, knew what marriage truly meant. Responsibility, duty, a sharp turn away from the reckless joys of youth. So they ran from it. For a night, loudly, messily, and sometimes violently. Knights gambled away horses. Songs devolved into shouting. Sometimes there were duels. Friendly at first, then not. It wasn't uncommon for someone to wake up the next day with a bruised face and no idea whether the groom had even made it home. Occasionally, the festivities ended with someone sleeping in a trough or, worse, in the arms of someone who was not the bride. The church, unsurprisingly, hated every second of it. Priests called these gatherings feasts of sin. They preached that drunkenness before marriage was a direct invitation to hell, a betrayal of the sanctity of the vows about to be spoken. But of course, men are predictable. Tell them not to do something, and they'll do it louder. The more the church warned, the more outrageous the parties became. As the centuries passed, stag nights evolved. Nobles passed the tradition to merchants, who passed it to laborers. Taverns replaced castles. Wooden mugs replaced golden goblets. But the heart of the ritual stayed the same. A man on the brink of becoming a husband, throwing one final tantrum against the weight of the world he was about to inherit. Even the morning after had its own traditions. There was the inevitable hangover, a pounding reminder of temporary freedom. There were the whispered apologies, the confused memories, the silent understanding between friends. We will never speak of this, not because it was illegal, but because the groom now belonged to a different world. The world of responsibility, the world of family, the world where laughter must be quieter and choices must be justified. And what about the bride? She didn't have a party, not officially. Women were expected to remain composed, chaste, and calm. Her celebration was often a quiet dinner with female relatives, sharing advice she didn't ask for, sewing final touches onto dresses, and perhaps praying that the man she was marrying wouldn't arrive with blood on his sleeve or someone else's perfume on his neck. Yet, beneath all the chaos and foolishness, these medieval stag nights revealed something deeper, the terror of transformation. Marriage wasn't just a change of status. It was the end of a certain kind of identity. The reckless, roaming, unpredictable male who answered to no one. In a world ruled by land and legacy, to marry was to be claimed. And the bachelor party was a funeral for the boy who could no longer exist. Today, the traditions remain, though they've traded swords for silly hats and duels for karaoke. But the spirit lingers. When you see a modern groom stumbling down a sidewalk wearing glitter and regret, surrounded by friends yelling half-remembered toasts, know that you are not witnessing novelty. You're watching history echo in the streetlights, a medieval ritual disguised in plastic and neon. And somewhere, far away in time, a monk is still praying for all of them. When someone dies, we wear black. It's reflex. A quiet uniform that signals to the world, I'm grieving. It feels dignified, serious, and somehow ancient. As if people have always mourned in this color. But that's an illusion, a beautifully staged one. Because dressing in black to mourn isn't eternal tradition. It's a medieval fashion choice that got wildly out of hand. In the ancient world, people had different ideas about what grief should look like. The Romans, for example, dressed in white when mourning. Their funerals shimmered in the sunlight with loose linen robes, symbolic of purity, rebirth, and letting go. They walked through the heat of Italy in reflective fabrics, allowing their grief to breathe. There was solemnity, yes, but also an understanding that death was part of the cycle, not a statement. Then came medieval Europe, where nothing was simple and everything had to mean more than it appeared. Suffering became a performance, and clothing became a stage. By the high Middle Ages, black dye was among the most expensive pigments to produce. To wear it meant wealth. So when a noble died, the family wrapped themselves in the deepest, richest black they could afford, not to be humble, but to show just how seriously they were taking the loss. Black wasn't just a symbol of sorrow, it was a flex. Peasants, of course, couldn't afford the luxury of dramatic mourning. They wore what they had, which often meant dull browns or greys, or in some cases, nothing particularly special at all. And if they wailed or wept, it was less performance and more pain, raw and unadorned. Meanwhile, the noble classes choreographed their grief like an opera. Slow walks, covered faces, veils that swept the floor, and sleeves long enough to gather tears even if none were actually shed. The church loved it. Black, to them, represented humility. Not necessarily sincerity, but at least the appearance of it. In a world obsessed with spiritual optics, wearing black was less about your personal grief and more about reminding everyone that you knew your place. Beneath God, beneath the heavens, beneath the weight of divine judgment. Conveniently, it also made the clergy's permanent black wardrobe seem pious, rather than simply practical. A bishop in mourning robes looked no different from a bishop on Tuesday. Over time, as with all things aristocratic, the style trickled downward. What started as a noble tradition became a cultural expectation. To wear anything other than black to a funeral became a quiet social offense, a sign that maybe you didn't care enough. Grief needed to be visible, and the darker your clothing, the deeper your soul must ache. By the 14th century, entire courts would enter what was called mourning black. Not for days, for years. When a monarch died, everyone from chambermaids to cousins was expected to wrap themselves in shadow. There were even rules about how long a widow must wear black. Sometimes for the rest of her life. And then, of course, there was Queen Victoria, the woman who took mourning and turned it into a personal brand. After the death of her husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, she wore black for 40 years. 40 years of lace and jet jewelry and veils that whispered, "Don't even try to move on." Her grief was real, but the aesthetic was calculated. She made sorrow fashionable, and the world followed. Eventually, the religious meaning of black faded, but the visual power remained. Today, we arrive at funerals dressed like somber bureaucrats. Quiet, neat, unthreatening. Not because we're trying to impress God or prove our status, but because it's what's expected. No one questions it, no one thinks about it, we just know. Black means loss. But the rest of the world didn't get the memo. In much of Asia, white is the color of mourning. Pale, plain, stripped of ornament. A reminder that the soul is leaving the world, returning to something cleaner. In many parts of Africa, bright colors celebrate the life of the departed, a visual declaration that death is not an end, but a transformation. Yet in the West, we cling to the darkness. Maybe because we're still in love with the idea that grief must be theatrical, that sorrow should look expensive, that silence should be tailored. So the next time you stand in line at a funeral home, adjusting your black tie or smoothing your dress, remember, you're not just showing respect. You're participating in a medieval pageant, one born not from spiritual wisdom, but from a belief that grief, like everything else, should be stylish. You're not mourning, you're modeling. You probably don't think twice when someone offers their hand in greeting. You shake it, perhaps with a smile or a polite nod. And the moment passes. Simple, automatic, routine. It feels like the most neutral human gesture imaginable. But beneath that modern civility lies a medieval ritual forged in fear, sharpened by steel, and performed as a test of survival. Because in the violent, suspicious world of the Middle Ages, nobody assumed you came in peace. Medieval society was a landscape of unspoken tension. Everyone was someone's debtor. Every cousin could be a rival. Every stranger was a potential threat. Most men, especially those of wealth, influence, or military rank, carried weapons. Daggers hidden beneath cloaks, short swords at their belts, or even blades tucked into boots. Conflict simmered just below the surface of daily life. So when two men met, they didn't smile and wave. They extended their right hands, the sword hands, palms open and visible, not as a greeting, but as a declaration. Look, I'm not holding a weapon. You can breathe, for now. This was not affection. It was a mutual weapons check, the shake part of the handshake. That came a little later. A small movement, a jiggle or bounce, intended to dislodge any hidden knife that might be strapped up a sleeve. A little theatrical, yes, but also effective. If a dagger clattered to the ground, the message was clear. Someone didn't come to chat. Knights did it. Merchants did it. Even kings did it. And everyone did it with a quiet calculation. Are you a threat? Are you lying? Do I need to reach for my own blade in the next 5 seconds? And God help you if you were left-handed. Left-handedness in a right-handed world was seen as suspicious, even sinister. The Latin word for left, sinistra, is the origin of the English word sinister. Why? Because a left-handed person's sword was on the wrong side. Their handshake couldn't be trusted. You might extend your right hand in peace, but they could still draw from their left. It threw off the ritual. It disrupted the pattern, and in the Middle Ages, disrupting the pattern could get you killed. Eventually, as the constant threat of being stabbed on the spot began to fade, though not by much, the handshake softened. By the 16th century, it had evolved into a formal greeting among equals, a silent agreement. We are not enemies. We are men of equal station, and we are choosing, for now, not to kill each other. It replaced bows in many circles, became a way to signal mutual respect, but its roots were never forgotten. Even as it made its way into diplomacy, religion, and business, the handshake retained a hidden language. Trust, offered in the form of temporary disarmament. Then came the modern world, or at least what pretended to be modern. The handshake was rebranded. No longer a test for weapons, it became a test of professionalism. Businessmen turned it into a tool of networking. Firm grip, direct eye contact, confidence, integrity. But still, beneath all the etiquette guides and HR training manuals, the ancient instinct persisted. This is how I show you I'm not hiding a threat. And even when science told us to stop, during pandemics, flu seasons, or times of high contagion, many of us refused. Doctors warned. Posters were printed. Elbows were offered instead. But people kept shaking hands. Why? Because shaking hands isn't just about manners. It's muscle memory for a world where trust could get you killed. Today, in corporate meetings, on campaign trails, at dinner parties, people still perform this ancient dance. Palm to palm, grip to grip, smiles concealing judgments. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, you'll notice a slight pressure, just enough to let you know. I could crush your fingers if I wanted to. So the next time someone extends their hand and says, "Nice to meet you," consider this. They're not just saying hello. They're reenacting a silent ritual, older than the job they're interviewing for, older than the building they're standing in, older even than the idea of nation-states or democracy. They are, in a way, whispering a medieval truth through the guise of politeness. I come in peace, for now. If you've ever been told not to talk with your mouth full, not to lick your knife or to keep your elbows off the table, you might have assumed these were just rules meant to make you more refined. But in the Middle Ages, table manners weren't about elegance. They were a desperate attempt to not die at dinner. Because dining in medieval Europe, especially outside the nobility, wasn't graceful. It was warfare. Picture a long, crowded wooden table. No porcelain, no individual plates, no napkins. In front of you is a trencher, not a plate, but a chunk of stale, often rock-hard bread that serves as your dish. On it, communal meat, soup, and whatever stew has been ladled from a single pot boiling over a smoky hearth. People reach across you. Hands are greasy. Fingers disappear into bowls. Coughs erupt without warning. And that one guy across from you, he's wiping his face on the dog. Yes, that was a thing. Napkins didn't exist. So guests wiped their fingers on their clothes, the tablecloth, if there was one, or, if none of that was handy, the nearest animal. In monasteries, monks complained that visitors would dry their greasy hands on sacred books, leaving scriptures smudged with mutton fat and beer foam. It got so bad that rules had to be written, actual, formal rules, telling people not to blow their noses into shared linens or inspect their teeth with their daggers, because someone had already done it. And if you're thinking this was just among peasants, think again. Even among the nobility, where the food was better and the halls grander, etiquette had to be enforced like battlefield strategy. Because when people eat together with no personal utensils and no understanding of hygiene, things get dangerous. Fast. Most people used only one knife, which they brought from home. There were no forks, as we covered earlier, and spoons were optional. Often, everyone dipped into a shared pot with the same tool or fingers, which means one infected cut or one unwashed hand could doom the whole table. The result? A hotbed of disease, dysentery, and the kind of food poisoning that didn't get you a refund. It got you a coffin. By the 13th century, someone finally had enough. Etiquette books began appearing, like the Book of the Civilized Man, that tried to turn dinner from a survival exercise into something more bearable. These guides weren't lofty tomes on grace, they were emergency manuals. They told you not to scratch yourself while eating, not to spit on the table, not to stir the pot with your personal knife, not to pick your teeth with your fingers and then immediately grab the bread. These weren't abstract moral lessons. They were instructions to keep people alive. The upper classes, eager to distinguish themselves from the unclean masses, began weaponizing these manners as social tools. Cleanliness became class. If you ate without slobbering, if you used a cloth to wipe your fingers, if you managed not to belch in the middle of a meal, congratulations. You weren't just civilized. You were elite. The church, always ready to moralize the mundane, joined in. Proper behavior at the table, they preached, reflected the condition of your soul. To slurp soup modestly was to honor God. To wipe your beard in public was practically sacrilegious. Slowly, eating became a performance. Not of appetite, but of control. And as the Renaissance bloomed, so did dining drama. Banquets became arenas where nobles showed off their refinement. Courses were timed, music played, servants orchestrated food like choreography. You weren't there to eat. You were there to prove that you weren't a barbarian. Even though, underneath the velvet and the manners, many still were. Fast forward to now, and you'll find echoes of those medieval fears in every modern meal. Don't chew with your mouth open. Don't talk while eating. Use the correct fork. Don't slouch. Don't reach. Don't burp. Don't pick. Don't double dip. These aren't just about manners. They're a legacy. A memory passed down in whispers from the plague-ridden halls of medieval Europe. Because in another time, not following the rules of the table didn't make you impolite. It made you dangerous. You probably think of the weekend as a modern invention, a gift from labor unions forged through strikes and protests, handed down by enlightened bosses who finally realized that humans aren't machines. You might even picture it as a reward. 2 sacred days of rest, earned through 5 days of toil. But if you trace its roots deep enough, you'll find something stranger, older, and far more medieval. Because the truth is, the concept of the weekend began not with kindness or capitalism, but with fear. Specifically, the church's fear of what peasants might do when left unsupervised. Let's go back. In early medieval Europe, there was no weekend. There were no off days. You worked. All the time. From sunrise to sunset. You worked if you were sick. You worked if it rained. You worked until your hands bled and your knees gave out. Rest wasn't part of the system. It was laziness, a sin, a luxury only the dead could afford. But the church, that vast, sacred machine with priests in every village and saints for every occasion, saw a problem. People were working too much. Not because the church cared about exhaustion or wellness, but because too much work meant too little prayer, and too little prayer meant sin, and sin meant rebellion, chaos, damnation, and worst of all, empty pews. So the church made a deal. It designated holy days, feast days, sprinkled generously across the calendar. Some were obvious, like Christmas or Easter. Others were more obscure, honoring saints with names no one could pronounce, or events that seemed suspiciously invented just to justify a party. Each feast day was a mini holiday, a day off, a reason to stop working, go to Mass, and maybe drink a little, or a lot. And there were so many of them. In some regions, over 100 days a year were designated for rest, which led to one medieval bishop complaining bitterly, "The peasants work 1 day and rest 3. The very first HR complaint in history. And yet it worked. The people came to church, they sang, they prayed, they listened, sometimes, to sermons about sin and salvation. And then, as soon as the formalities ended, they feasted. These weren't quiet, pious picnics. These were wild, unrestrained celebrations. Ale flowed freely, dances erupted in muddy fields. There were games, flirting, and occasional fist fights. For the peasantry, it was less a sacred obligation and more a licensed escape. The nobles, of course, disapproved. The church, too, began to feel conflicted. Yes, attendance had improved. But people seemed to be enjoying themselves a little too much. Enter the Reformation. As Protestant reformers swept through Europe, they looked at the Catholic calendar and saw decadence disguised as devotion. They slashed feast days, declared many saints unworthy of celebration. The Puritans, ever the joyful bunch, went even further. They banned most holidays entirely. To them, resting too often was proof that you weren't serious about your salvation. They kept just 1 day, Sunday. But now, Sunday wasn't about music or wine or dancing in the fields. It was about silence, scripture, and strict observation. You went to church, you went home, and you didn't work, not because you needed rest, but because God demanded your attention, and nothing else. Then, centuries later, the Industrial Revolution arrived, all smoke and metal, and over time. Workers were shoved into factories, their lives chopped into shifts. The days were long, the air was poisonous, accidents were frequent. Employers quickly realized something odd. Overworked people broke machines, and when they broke, they cost money. So, begrudgingly, industrialists began to reintroduce the idea of rest. First, they agreed to let workers leave early on Saturday. Just a half day. Then, eventually, full Saturdays were granted, not because of compassion, but because hungover workers on Monday were less productive. Slowly, the modern weekend was born, a secular resurrection of a religious compromise. And now, we collapse into Fridays like survivors of a battle. We cling to Saturdays with desperation. We treat Sundays like sacred ground, sacred not to God, perhaps, but to grocery runs, naps, and mentally preparing to start again. Most of us don't go to church, but we still obey the rhythm, still follow the calendar shaped by bishops and monks and men who believed that time belonged to heaven. The irony is rich. We thank labor laws, we credit progressive politics, but our precious weekend began as an attempt to control sin, to manage the soul through scheduling. And somehow that legacy survived plagues, Puritans, and industrial smokestacks. So the next time you lie in bed on a lazy Sunday morning, dreading the work week ahead, remember, you're not just enjoying your time, you're reenacting a sacred pause, a medieval ceasefire between labor and salvation, and like all ancient bargains, it still carries the echo of its first purpose, not to rest, but to repent. You slip on a wedding ring and it feels symbolic, a soft metal circle that whispers love, loyalty, forever. But what if that circle is less a symbol of eternal romance and more a centuries-old receipt? A contract forged in gold, not by poets, but by property law. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about love. It was a transaction. Families negotiated terms, land changed hands, wealth was redistributed. The bride and groom, they were participants in a deal made above their heads, their future sealed not with a kiss, but with a signature. Or, more often, a handshake. But this handshake wasn't enough. The church, always eager to brand the personal as sacred, needed something visible, something the community could see, something that shouted, "This woman now belongs to someone." Enter the ring. The idea of circular jewelry representing eternity goes back to ancient Egypt. Their bands were woven from reeds or bone, fragile, impermanent. But the symbolism stuck. The Greeks and Romans borrowed the idea, but added their own twist. Men gave rings to women as proof of ownership. Not affection. Possession. By the time this tradition reached medieval Europe, the church saw an opportunity. They rebranded the ring. Not as a token of transaction, but as a holy vow. A ritualized binding overseen by clergy, sanctified by God. The ceremony evolved. Rings were placed on the fourth finger of the left hand because medieval science insisted there was a vein in that finger that ran straight to the heart, the vena amoris. It wasn't true, of course, but it was poetic, and poetry, like religion, needs symbols. Still, this wasn't romance. It was obedience. A ring on a woman's hand marked her as spoken for, legally, spiritually, and socially. It told other men to stay away and reminded her that she had been transferred, not chosen. Men, interestingly, wore no such rings. For centuries, only women bore the band, because only they needed to be marked. A husband's fidelity was optional. A wife's was mandatory. The ring was not mutual. It was one-directional, from authority to submission. It wasn't until the 20th century, during World War II, that the tradition began to shift. Soldiers heading off to war began wearing rings to remember their wives. It was sentimental, emotional, and for the first time, somewhat equal. After the war, the jewelry industry capitalized on the trend. Ring marketing exploded. Ads linked gold bands with devotion, diamonds with eternity, and matching rings with modern partnership. The symbolism had changed, but the ritual hadn't. Even now, the wedding ring carries echoes of its past. It is still legal proof of union. It still communicates availability, or the lack thereof. It still ties emotion to material, memory to metal. And while we may wear it with love, its roots remain tangled in ownership, not intimacy. Look closely at the ring on your finger, or someone else's. See its shine, feel its weight, but also hear what it whispers, quietly, from history. You are claimed, you are accounted for. This bond is not just emotional, it is contractual. And behind the altar, behind the vows, behind the white dress and the champagne toasts, there still lingers the original truth. You are not just in love. You are part of a medieval agreement, beautifully packaged, perfectly circular, infinitely binding. Today, privacy feels like a right, a closed door, a quiet room, the ability to think, cry, rest, or rage without witnesses. We assume it's natural, that humans have always sought solitude. But for much of medieval Europe, privacy simply didn't exist, not because people didn't want it, but because their world didn't allow it. Imagine a peasant home in the 12th century, a one-room hut, walls of mud and timber, a thatched roof leaking in the rain. Inside, a fire pit, a few stools, a shared bed made of straw, parents, children, grandparents, animals, all sleeping in the same space, often under the same blanket. No bedrooms, no walls, no quiet corners, just shared breath and shared life. Nobles had more space, castles, chambers, great halls, but not much more solitude. Servants hovered constantly. Guards stood nearby. Even monarchs rarely spent a moment alone. Letters were read aloud. Baths were supervised. Beds were shared, not always sexually, but communally. Warmth was more urgent than modesty. So where could you go to be alone? Nowhere. But there was one thing. Fabric. The curtain. Not the thick drapes of a modern mansion, but simple cloth panels hung from wooden beams, around a bed, across a doorway, sometimes even around a stool or basin, thin, fluttering, often filthy, but revolutionary. Because behind a curtain, even briefly, you were unseen, unobserved, and in a world where eyes were everywhere. Neighbors, family, clergy, the crown, being unseen meant being free. For a moment, this was the birth of privacy. It began in the bedroom, or rather, the bed space. Canopy beds emerged, not as decoration, but as devices. They enclosed sleepers in fabric walls, gave them a chamber within a chamber. Couples whispered behind them. Letters were written in secret. Illicit lovers hid there. So did secrets, and sometimes sins. As fabric became more available, curtains spread. Monks used them to separate writing desks. Nobles used them to divide halls. Even confessionals, the little boxes we now associate with dark wood and sacred guilt, began as curtained booths. And slowly, a shift occurred. The church, which had once preached that privacy was suspicious, "Why hide if you have nothing to confess?" began to realize its value. Solitude allowed for reflection, prayer, inner dialogue. The soul, it turned out, needed silence, and silence required space. By the Renaissance, the idea of the private self was blossoming. Writers began keeping diaries. Artists painted themselves. Architects designed homes with chambers for reading, study, rest. The rich wanted not just luxury, but retreat. And with retreat came revolution.
Because once people had space to think, they started thinking differently. About faith, about power, about who they were when no one was watching. Privacy didn't just change comfort, it changed consciousness. Fast forward to today and privacy is everywhere and under siege. We live in rooms with locks, scroll screens no one else can see, whisper into phones, hide tabs, post anonymously, and still we crave more. Solitude has become sacred, a commodity, a battlefield, but the roots of that craving, they hang from a medieval beam, a curtain drawn across a straw mattress, a whisper in the dark, a life lived for a moment unobserved. So the next time you pull the curtain closed or shut the bathroom door or sit alone in silence, remember, you're not just making space, you're continuing a quiet rebellion. One born not from luxury, but from the simple, radical desire to be your whole self, when no one else is looking. Today, keeping a diary feels innocent, maybe even dull. A teenager writes about their crush. A traveler documents sunsets and meals. A parent jots down memories. The pages are private, fragile, forgettable. But in the Middle Ages, writing down your thoughts could be a revolutionary act. Because back then, your thoughts weren't yours. The church claimed your soul, the crown claimed your body, your family claimed your duty, And your interior life, your fears, questions, and doubts belonged to no one. Or rather, they were expected to belong to God. To stray from doctrine, even in silence, was already dangerous. To write it down, that was reckless. And yet, some did. The earliest medieval diaries weren't diaries at all. They were books of hours, structured prayer manuals carried by the devout. But soon people began scribbling notes in the margins. Not prayers, thoughts, feelings, sometimes even frustrations. A monk might write, "I am angry today and do not know why." A merchant might scrawl, "My wife shamed me before my sons." These weren't confessions. They were cracks in the wall. These margin notes were the beginning of something subversive. The idea that your inner life mattered, even if no one else ever saw it. Of course, not everyone approved. The church feared the written self, not just because it might contradict doctrine, but because it could survive. A spoken doubt vanished in the air. A written doubt lived forever, ink on parchment, bound in leather, passed down, discovered, dissected. And nothing spread heresy faster than something written in the first person. There were cases of diaries being used as evidence in trials. Inquisitors loved written confessions, even if they weren't meant for anyone else. A woman who wrote about seeing demons in her dreams could be accused of witchcraft. A man who admitted, even privately, to doubting the Trinity could be condemned as a heretic. So why risk it? Because something was changing. By the 14th and 15th centuries, literacy was spreading. Paper was cheaper. Merchants began keeping journals to track trade. But again, in the margins, something strange began to appear: feelings. A lost deal made someone ashamed. A customer's insult lingered. The market was not just a place of coins, but of emotion. And then came the Renaissance. Humanism bloomed. Individuality was no longer suspect, it was celebrated. Suddenly, the idea of I think, I feel, I wonder had value. Thinkers like Petrarch began writing letters to himself. Not because he was lonely, but because he believed the self was worth knowing, worth preserving, worth archiving. By the 16th century, personal journals became a quiet trend among the educated. But they were still risky. A wrong word could mean disgrace. Or worse. Take the case of Girolamo Savonarola, the fiery Florentine preacher. He kept journals of his visions, his conversations with God. After his execution, his writings were used to prove his madness and heresy. His inner world was weaponized, a mirror turned against him, but people kept writing. Women, in particular, found in diaries a rare form of freedom. In a world that silenced them in public, they spoke in ink. They wrote about childbirth, loneliness, desire, resentment. Their words weren't published, but they endured. And centuries later, historians found in these diaries not just voices, but truths. By the Enlightenment, journals had become almost expected. Philosophers, scientists, explorers all kept records. But even then, the line between self-reflection and self-endangerment remained thin. In authoritarian regimes, diaries became evidence. In religious orders, they became surveillance. Even today, in parts of the world, keeping a private journal can be risky. And yet, we still do it. We write to remember, to process, to ask questions we're afraid to speak aloud. And in doing so, we echo the medieval scribes who hid their thoughts in margins, the merchants who tracked not just gold, but guilt, and the women who wrote what no one else would hear. So the next time you open a blank page and write, "Dear Diary," know this: you are participating in an ancient act of rebellion. You are preserving a self that might otherwise vanish. You are proving, in ink, that your inner world exists and matters. And in a history that tried for so long to erase it, that is a kind of triumph. You probably think of a pillow as a basic human comfort, a square of fluff beneath your head. Essential, obvious. But for most of history, the pillow wasn't comfort, it was controversy. Because softness wasn't always seen as civilized. In the ancient world, pillows were luxury. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, only the wealthy used them, and not for comfort. These early pillows were hard, made of carved wood or stone. Their purpose wasn't to cradle the neck, but to keep hair intact, or to elevate the head from crawling insects. Function, not feeling. Then came the Greeks and Romans. They introduced the idea of soft pillows stuffed with feathers or wool. But even then, they weren't for everyone. Pillows were reserved for the elite, the educated, the idle. Soldiers and slaves slept on the ground. Philosophers warned that too much softness dulled the mind. To rest your head on a cushion was to admit weakness. By the time we reach medieval Europe, the pillow had become both widespread and suspicious. Among the nobility, embroidered cushions signaled wealth and refinement. A throne wasn't a throne without a velvet pillow. Religious leaders used silk-covered bolsters during long prayers. But outside the castles and cathedrals, pillows were frowned upon, especially for men. In 13th century England, King Henry III banned the use of soft pillows for men at court. They were declared effeminate, indulgent, and unmanly. A warrior, it was believed, should rest his head on stone or wood. Anything softer made him morally and physically weak. Monks, too, rejected pillows. In monastic life, discomfort was a virtue. Pain kept the soul alert. Rest was dangerous, a gateway to sin. To sleep too well was to invite temptation. In some orders, using a pillow was considered a form of gluttony, an indulgence of the flesh. And yet people still longed for softness, so they improvised. Peasants stuffed sacks with hay or straw. Some used rolled-up cloaks. Others laid their heads on folded arms. A pillow was whatever you could find, but the dream of a true plush cushion, that belonged to the rich. In Asia, the story was different and stranger. In imperial China, ceramic and porcelain pillows were common, beautiful, fragile, and cold. They were shaped like boxes or animals or clouds. Some were even inscribed with poetry. These weren't for comfort. They were believed to preserve beauty, channel dreams, and promote health. A soft pillow, they feared, would absorb energy and dull the spirit. In Japan, the makura, a small wooden or ceramic headdress, served a similar purpose. Women slept with their necks propped up to protect elaborate hairstyles. Comfort was sacrificed for image, rest for discipline. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that pillows began to spread widely in the West. Mass production made them cheap. Cotton and feathers became accessible. Suddenly, even the working class could afford a cushion. And as science began linking rest to health, attitudes shifted. Softness wasn't weakness. It was self-care. But the moral anxiety never fully disappeared. Even today, some people brag about not needing a pillow. Travelers bring inflatable neck rests, but sleep sitting up. Athletes talk about the firmest pillow on the market. And luxury pillow brands sell not just comfort but identity. Orthopedic memory foam, cooling gel, anti-snore tech. The pillow is still more than a rectangle of fluff. It's a declaration of class, of taste, of how much you think you're allowed to relax. And in the silence of your bedroom, in the dark where no one watches, the pillow becomes something else entirely. A secret indulgence, a cradle for dreams, a place where for a few hours the world softens. So the next time you rest your head on a pillow, think of this. You're not just going to sleep. You're touching a long, uneasy history, one that stretches from pharaohs to monks, from battlefields to bedrooms, from rejection to obsession. You're resting on something once forbidden, and that softness beneath your skull, it's revolutionary. Today, we mask our scent. We scrub, spray, deodorize. We buy products promising to make us smell like rain, cashmere, or cool sport. We apologize for sweat. We hide behind perfume. But for most of human history, the way you smelled wasn't something to be hidden. It was who you were. In the Middle Ages, smell wasn't cosmetic, it was identity. It told others your class, your occupation, your faith, even your morality. People didn't wear deodorant, they wore themselves, and everyone else could smell it. Peasants smelled like soil, livestock, ash. Their scent was the smell of work. Nobles smelled like damp velvet, beeswax, horses, sometimes incense. Priests carried the scent of candle, smoke, wine, and fasting. Soldiers, steel, leather, old sweat, blood, and no one found that strange. Because in a world without industrial hygiene, Scent wasn't an embarrassment, it was data. Your smell told people if you were clean enough to be trusted, rich enough to be obeyed, or holy enough to be feared. Of course, that doesn't mean people didn't wash. They did, but not the way we do. Bathing was rare, public, and often ritualistic. In many towns, bathhouses doubled as social hubs, places to talk, flirt, make deals. But they were also suspect. The church warned that too much washing encouraged vanity and lust. Clean skin, it feared, led to dirty thoughts. So many bathed with cloths and basins. Scent came not from removing odor but from layering over it. Medieval perfume was crude but powerful. Rosewater, vinegar, herbs boiled in wine. The wealthy carried pomanders, hollow metal balls filled with spices to ward off foul air and bad spirits. Doctors stuffed their plague masks with lavender and myrrh. Smell, they believed, was protection against sickness, against sin. But there was something deeper. In many parts of medieval Europe, it was believed that your scent revealed your soul. A saint, it was said, would smell sweet even in death, a miracle called the odor of sanctity. Martyrs' bodies, when exhumed, were expected to smell like lilies, not rot. If they didn't, perhaps they weren't so holy after all. Conversely, heretics were said to stink even before death. Their odor marked them, and in a world terrified of invisible corruption, to smell wrong was dangerous. Then came the rise of bathing culture, briefly. In the later Middle Ages, as trade expanded and cities grew, so did the desire for cleanliness. Soap-making became a craft. Nobles imported exotic oils. Baths became private. But just as this new hygiene began to bloom, disaster struck, the Black Death. The plague changed everything. People believed that scent carried disease. Miasma, bad air, was the killer. And the solution: seal yourself away, burn herbs. Avoid the stinking poor. Smell became fear. It divided communities. And once again, to smell wrong was to be guilty, even if you weren't sick. Centuries later, the Enlightenment sanitized everything. Science replaced superstition. Cleanliness became godliness. Perfume was refined. Soap was industrialized. The nose became a social weapon. To smell natural was to be shameful. We began living not just in deodorized homes, but in deodorized identities. And so here we are. Today, we scrub away every trace of ourselves. We view body odor as failure. We shame sweat. We define attraction through artificial fragrance. We have mastered cleanliness and forgotten what it meant to be known by scent alone. But history hasn't forgotten. Behind every spritz of perfume is a monastery filled with incense. Behind every bar of soap is a bathhouse echoing with laughter and sin. Behind every deodorant ad is a whisper from a time when people smelled like what they did, what they believed, and who they loved. And maybe, just maybe, there's something honest in that.